Welcome to this fifth talk on ancient Rome, produced by the Classics Department at East London Science School. Today, I'll be talking to you about the Augustan poets, focusing on four poets who wrote during the time of the reign of Augustus and whose influence has been felt ever since. I start first with Virgil. His dates are 70 BC to 19 BC. So really, it was only towards the very end of his life that he wrote for the Emperor Augustus. Before he was discovered by Augustus, he wrote his two bucolic poems about farming, the Eclogues and the Georgics. Both of them are set in rural Italy, and it's quite clear that Virgil has a great love of the countryside. The poems focus on some love stories and some classical figures, and he was very influenced by Theocritus. There's also elements of didactic poetry, a guide to farming in the Georgics. His main work, however, was the Aeneid, the great foundation poem of Rome. The journey of Aeneas leading the surviving refugees of Troy through the Mediterranean via Carthage and his brief but fiery love affair with Dido to the shores of Italy, where they have to defeat the local people and eventually found a city which will be turned by Aeneas' ancestors, Iulus and then Romulus and Remus, into the city of Rome. Now this poem was incredibly important because it really consolidated Augustus' position as the rightful ruler of Rome. Augustus was descended or claimed descendants from the hero of this poem, Aeneas. Virgil supposedly wrote 2 lines of hexameter poetry per day, and this is a 12-book epic poem, so it would have taken him many years. Upon his deathbed, he claimed it was unfinished and wished that it would be burnt. Luckily for us, this wish was turned down. The main debate with the Aeneid is the fact that, although it explicitly praises Augustus and is set around glorifying his family and his position in Rome, there are also several undertones which are potentially critical towards his rule, mainly focused on the human cost of war. The quote in Book 1 of the Aeneid, "Tantae mollis erat Romanum condere gentem," so great was the sacrifice to found the Roman race. Those who argue against such criticism say, how on earth would Virgil get away with this when Augustus was reading his poem? There are 2 potential answers to this. Number 1, Virgil only read the sections to Augustus that glorified him because no one would ever hear this poem performed in its entirety. And once Virgil was dead, it didn't really matter what Augustus thought. Option number 2, which I think is more likely, given that Augustus was such a clever ruler, he would have known that he had to accept such criticism. There were thousands of Italians and Romans who had lost their sons or their brothers or their husbands during the wars fighting for Augustus. And the fact that Virgil, writing for their emperor, was willing to accept this was something that Augustus would have actually been in favor of. Our next poet to turn to is Horace. Horace wrote a huge variety of poetry, including his most famous odes, but also the epistles, the satires, and the Carmen Saeculare. I'll focus first on the odes. Now, Horace's odes were often about the countryside. He was given a house by Augustus in the hills, the Sabine hills outside Rome, and he wrote about the beauty of nature and the passing of time. His famous quote, "Carpe diem," seize the day, or "Permite divis cetera," leave the rest to the gods. He never wanted anyone to worry about the future. On the topic of Augustus, he was reasonably neutral, sometimes writing to praise him, and sometimes less so, less explicit than Virgil or Ovid perhaps. He did comment upon war, however, and in general, he was not really that keen on it. His famous quote, "Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori," later used by Wilfred Owen during World War I to describe an anti-war sentiment. Perhaps this was because Horace actually fought in the war himself, in the Republican Wars, the Battle of Philippi, where he lost and was later forgiven by Octavian and then Augustus. Our third poet, Propertius. He is a poet of Latin love elegy. Elegy is a style of poem written in couplets, became very popular during this time and then later. Propertius wrote his poetry mainly aimed at his lover Cynthia, most likely a pseudonym, but his lines have always been used as an example of very beautiful Latin poetry. He did not write a huge amount about Augustus himself. Finally, we have Ovid, again an author of a huge variety, and the latest in terms of dates of the four that I've chosen to talk about. Ovid started by writing poems about love, the Ars Amatoria, the art of love, the Remedia Amoris, a remedy for love, and just the Amores, loves. Now these poems would give advice to young lovers, who were often tongue-in-cheek, often quite explicit as well, clearly very popular amongst the aristocrats of Rome. He then set out upon his greatest work, his Metamorphoses, his huge epic poem, about twice the length of the Aeneid, but with a twist. Ovid starts the Metamorphoses by saying that Apollo wanted him to write an epic poem, but stole away afoot, meaning that he would write an epic poem, but it would not be an epic that everyone expects. It would not be one main character or one main theme or about gods or heroes, but really a collection of about 250 different myths which twist and turn and involve lots of change, hence the title Metamorphoses. The Metamorphoses were incredibly influenced by the poetry of the Hellenistic poet Callimachus, who also rejected the idea of writing a traditional epic poem. Ovid's life came to a rather unpleasant end when in AD 8 he was exiled from Rome. We do not know the reason, but he reports it as Carmen et Error, a song and a mistake, and theories include that he wrote a poem that insulted a member of the Augustus's family. What we do know is that he was sent to Tomis, a city in modern-day Bulgaria on the shores of the Black Sea. He hated it there, and he wrote two poems, the Tristia, Sadnesses, and Epistulae ex Ponto, Letters from the Black Sea. These poems are full of descriptions of the locals as hairy barbarians who can't speak Latin and are uncivilized, and the fact that the weather is always very cold. Even though Ovid had this sad end to his life, it is amazing that he kept on writing and sending his poems to Rome during this time, forever productive despite the hardship he had to go through. So that is just a very brief overview of the four main Augustan poets, and a huge proportion of the most interesting Latin poetry and literature has come from this period.